Hello, so we're starting to look at contemporary Southern Africa in this lecture. So this is Malangatana. This piece was made in 1965. And I'm showing you this particular piece because it gives you a little bit of an idea of what life is like in modern Southern Africa. So this piece was done in 1965, but the conditions that the artist is talking about are very familiar nowadays. So early pencil drawings depict with economy of line the suffering endured by ordinary people and a toxic chemistry of chronic poverty and colonialism, with bared pointed teeth, protruding eyes, and screaming heads, recurring motifs and works from that period. So just to give you an idea what this is about, he's looking at workers, and it's at the end of the day. So let's read this poem. In the cool waters of the river, we shall have fish that are huge. We shall give the sign of the end of the world, perhaps, because they will make an end of woman, woman who adorns the fields, woman who is the fruit of man. The flying fish makes an end of searching because woman is the gold of man. When she sings, she even seems like the Fado singer's well-tuned guitar. When she dies, I shall cut her hair to deliver me from sin. Women's hair shall be the blanket over the coffin when another artist calls me to heaven to paint me. Woman's breast shall be in the pillow. Woman's eye shall open up the way to heaven, and women's belly shall give to me up there, and women's glance shall watch as I go up to heaven. So what he's talking about here is this kind of concept of feminine power, but at the same time, it's a very down-to-earth type of poem. How it works usually in modern Southern Africa, including back then in 1965, is people that work in mining, which is a pretty good chunk of the population. They travel to where the mines are, and the company they work for provides housing for them near the mines, but they have to be away from their families at months of a time, and they can't travel back and forth very easily. So as you can see, they're wearing rags in this picture, and they're getting out, and they have this kind of like emptiness to their faces. So art under apartheid, I have to give you a little bit of background about apartheid. So in 1949, there was an Afrikaner-led government. At the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the Afrikaners, who are descended from the Dutch colonists, had fought with the British, for whom the colony of Southern Africa, South Africa was originally. And in 1949, they finally got their, I'm going to put the air quotes up, their independence from the British. But again, these are people who are foreigners from just the 19th century, and much like the colonists in the Americas had taken over the lands of the indigenous people. So this Afrikaner-led government codified divisions between populations based upon assigned racial categories. And I should mention that the Afrikaner government was inspired by a couple of different governments, one of which still exists today. The first one that doesn't exist anymore is the Nazi government in Germany during World War II. And they liked the way that they used this very technocratic system to be able to classify people racially, and then be able to consolidate the power in, a very narrow group of people. The other government that they were inspired by was the U.S. They respected what they had seen the U.S. had done with Native Americans, moving them out of the way, taking their land and resources. So with these inspirations, they developed their government. And the way that they developed it, again, inspired by the Nazis and the United States, is that every person that was born had to carry a identification card, and the identification card would say that you were either black, colored, or you wouldn't need to say you were white. It would just show. So as you might expect, the white people in South Africa were kept segregated from the rest of the population, and they were able to get all of the positions of power, both in private enterprise and in the public institutions. So they were in the government, they controlled the government completely, and there was no participation, essentially no participation from the other two groups. So if you were Black, you were basically at the bottom of the pile. You would be limited in the types of jobs that you could get, and there was a big propaganda program, and we'll see kind of an example of how this worked, to convince the Black population that, and this is the Bantu population, like Xhosa and such, to convince them that that was their station in life, and there was nothing else they could do. So they were particularly inspired by the education, and I'm putting the air quotes up again, education for American slaves, which was, to their mind, very effective in limiting the horizons of the Black population. So if you're colored, you were somewhere in between. That usually meant that you had a parent that was Black, and then maybe a while back, usually before the government, before 1949, you had a white parent as well, or a white grandparent or something along those lines. And with colored people, they were able to get a few more advantages than the Black population. There's certain jobs that were available to them that the Black population couldn't get. They got better public housing and better schools, but they were still educated in a way that limited their horizons. And an effort was made, especially as time went along, to insulate the white population, especially young people, from what was going on with the colored and the Black population. So this means they had to control international media and also control media within the country, so that the white population would not feel any sympathy or empathy for what was going on for Black and colored people. So when you see Dumile Fene, who dies in 1991, a lot of his pieces, you probably recognize, those of you especially in design. He has this kind of design style where you see the sketches that he's building up from. Vasona says that what he's portraying is despair and anger. So he was self-taught, but again, using techniques that I think you might recognize from design. He was eventually driven from South Africa because his work was talking about what was going on. Again, they wanted to control media. No amount of hardship and deprivation could stand between him and his art. In this one, you can see a kind of like almost universal image amongst Black liberation movements of chains and showing what they can do to a person. So if you want to comment about other meanings you might be getting out of this particular piece, or how Fene is using line and color, let me know. So let's take a look at the next one. So their contortions seem to capture not the physical environment, but the human response to it. I think what Vasona is talking about here is that it's not, when you see them, you don't necessarily see exactly what the figures are supposed to be doing. Instead, you see this kind of like exaggerated form that is expressing feeling. So a South African artist knows that his duty to the community as a whole is to prick the bubble of falsity and paint the reality of the mother in agony, agonizing over her dying child. So Fene is expressing something that most artists, even today in South Africa, express, that there is no non-political art in South Africa. Everything is, and again, as he says, there's a responsibility to the community to be able to talk about conditions as they are. So with this one, and he's calling a lot of his pieces untitled, signaling the shift from from the picturesque to one of the more intense engagement with the political climate of the time. Campbell Smith notes that the emergence of the clenched fist in a small bureau drawing by Dumile from the mid-1960s, possibly the earliest visual expression of what would become a symbol of resistance in Southern African art. So what he's talking about here is the raised black fist. If you're interested and you're looking for something to put on the extra credit board, you could try to find the origin of the raised black fist because it goes farther back into the 20th century than this particular drawing. But the raised black fist, it became a symbol. Another thing that you could look at is look up the Black Panthers and Black Power. You could also look up the 1968 Olympics and the Black Fist. So these would be both interesting things to do. But this also shows the relationship between international Black liberation movements, something that was very common at the time. When we talk about 20th century Black American art, we'll also talk about that kind of international focus that was going on at the time. So this one, Nobility, Freedom. When I talked about Southern African art, I hadn't talked about some of the styles that we're seeing here, like were found made by the Shona people at the Great Zimbabwe. And they took this stone called a soapstone and made these very kind of majestic looking stoic figures with these shapes of heads. So Fene is most likely influenced by that here. And he's looking at nobility and freedom. Again, using the chain, looking at the traditions. The Great Zimbabwe showed a very complex culture and then showing how it's chained. So nobility and freedom. He, together with other artists of his generation, also sought liberation through their art by, for example, consciously turning away from Western sources and looking to each other, as well as to African and Eastern sources for inspiration and strength. So again, this shows the kind of international focus of the Black liberation movements at the time. So this one is kind of a multi-layered piece, perhaps not political, perhaps so. This one's called Primeval Celestial Animal Heart, Verso, Condition Me Freedom in Genesis. This is one, again, if you want to take to the extra credit board, but if you look, there's kind of multiple layers going on. You can see with the red lines and then the pencil drawings underneath. So take some time with this particular one and see what you can read out of it. As far as content, hard to know, but see if you can get a little something out of it. This one, the classroom, is representing what you would see in South Africa at the time. And again, you can take the extra credit board and look at some things, but I'll just kind of summarize the interpretations I usually see in classes. We see a white teacher here, and then as we go downward, more and more Black students, and we can see how they're being stepped on, they're kind of hanging on. And we have the white students up here, and some of them seem to be crying or expressing emotion, but they are still stepping on the figures below. So this kind of shows the effects of apartheid in education. We can see at the top the white students or white teachers, and going all the way to the bottom, we can see that there's white teachers. So Black students only saw white teachers in South Africa, and their job was basically to propagandize to them and tell them that there's limits to what they can do. This is what they're supposed to do. Don't ask for more, all of those types of things. So an extremely kind of white supremacist type of education program that you saw in Southern Africa. Getting to still living contemporary Southern African artists, particularly from South Africa, is Willie Bester, pictured here. He was classified as colored, and Bester himself talks about how his body and his life is kind of an apartheid laboratory. So he lived in the Crossroads Township outside of Cape Town, and his mother was classified as colored, and his father was classified as Black. And again, whenever you're born, they classify you. Willie Bester was classified as colored, but unfortunately his siblings were classified as Black. So as a result, Bester and his mother were able to get housing that was of much higher quality and better education than his siblings and where his father could live. So Bester's mother and father discussed this, and they said, well, we want to be able to give opportunity to at least one of our children. And they decided that Bester would live with his mother in the colored community. So when you see his work, there's dense retelling of oppression, injustice, and deprivation. So again, this is the idea of a responsibility to show accurately what you see around you. And indeed, much of the work that we see from him functions as propaganda of sorts. And I'll talk about more specifically what they're thinking of with that. So people have built up a resistance to anything that addresses the psyche of mankind or people to themselves. I believe that we must protest against that which is wrong. There's no form of escape. Remaining apolitical is a luxury that Southern Africans simply cannot afford. So this one is called Semicozy. It's from his Migrant miniseries, made in 1993. And it's telling the story of a person who was a migrant worker. So I talked about migrant workers before with the miners, but there's other jobs that migrant workers do as well. And you can kind of see Willie Bester's style both in 2 and 3 dimensions. He does assemblages. So we're seeing that here. We can see the identity document, which classifies him, and then his wife and children, who he could visit for about 3 weeks a year. We see a wire bicycle wheel that refers to his job of recycling from trash dumps. And his note, which he wrote in response to losing his pension. So these jobs, of course, things are promised. You know, they can't, at this point, it wasn't possible to force people to work like it had been in past colonial governments. But as you may see, it's pretty typical in this kind of economy. There was a loss of his pension, which was a pretty common thing to happen to people at the time. Vasona has a pretty good summary of the story that's being told here. And again, when you listen to the story, think about how it's fairly typical for migrant workers and for a lot of workers in general in South Africa. So the story of a gentle, devout man who has spent most of his life working in the spiritual and physical squalor of the Crossroads Township outside Cape Town. Mr. Semicozy rented a bed, his only personal space in a house full of other people. An investor's collage of face peers out from beneath the bed springs in the center of the composition, as if imprisoned by them. Next to it, Bester has placed Semicozy's passbook, the apartheid identity document he was forced to carry with him at all times. Other faces are portraits of Semicozy's wife and children who lived in the distant Transkei region and whom he was allowed to visit only 3 weeks a year. The wire, bicycle wheel, and bits of trash refer to Semicozy's job recuperating material from the trash dumps. In the upper right corner is the text of Semicozy's desperate handwritten note. After years of hard work, he'd found out his employer would not give him a pension. The intensity of the packed, trash-littered surface communicates Bester's outrage at the way that Semicozy had been treated by his employer and by his society. So you can see kind of what he's doing here. Some of these images he had intended for them to be seen outside of South Africa to pressure certain governments to stop supporting South Africa. So this one, the homage to Steve Biko, and Biko was probably one of the most important liberation leaders, certainly in Southern Africa. He lived from 46 until 1977. He was an anti-apartheid activist and had organized people against apartheid, which, as you might imagine, the South African government was not a big fan of. This kind of reminds me of the Patriot Act in 1967. The Terrorism Act number 83 was passed. And what this did is it made most types of assemblages of people and classified them as terrorism. So authoritarian governments will generally treat things that they don't like and use the word terrorism. That way they can see themselves as defending themselves against a greater tyranny than themselves. So, a very common thing for the United States government to do as well. So unions, the types of meetings in towns that Steve Biko was doing, these were all made into terrorism. And this law in some ways was made specifically to stop Steve Biko and others like him. So he was arrested and he eventually dies in police custody. He was chained to a window grill, and we can see that in the picture. Biko is famous for a lot of things, but one of the things that lasted and traveled throughout the world, like the Black Fist, he is generally credited with coming up with the phrase "Black is beautiful." So Martin Luther King was quite enamored with this particular phrase and used it again over and over again in his speeches. So on the 11th of September, 1977, police loaded him into the back of a Land Rover. Land Rovers were common vehicles used by police and other public institutions around the world, naked and restrained in manacles, and began the 1,100 kilometer drive to Pretoria to take him to a prison with hospital facilities. While he was taken to the prison, and you can see his numbers written right there, room 619. At the end of the drive, they said that he had died. And an investigation, of course, said that the police did nothing wrong. As you might imagine, most people looked at this and they said he was murdered, which is almost certainly the case. And he became a martyr for anti-apartheid activism. So there were some effects of this. There were still a few European countries who were trading with South Africa and who were supporting them generally. And with this, it got international press, and people, most countries, with the exception of two, imposed sanctions on South Africa, stopped trading with them at the request of activists from South Africa, and tried to pressure the Southern African government to end apartheid. The two countries that did not go along were the United States and Israel. Israel's less important. They're basically a satellite of the United States. So South African activists moved towards trying to influence the United States. And because they were basically the remaining world power that was keeping the apartheid Afrikaner government afloat. So this one, Trojan Horse 3 from 2007, it refers to an event that finally got some movement in the United States. It was the Trojan Horse Massacre of October 1985. So I'll read you the story of it. The title of the work refers to the Trojan Horse Massacre in October 1985. Heightened tensions between anti-apartheid demonstrators and police came to a head in Cape Town suburb of Athlone. 11 days after the government declared a state of emergency in other parts of the country, police hid in the back of the Southern African Railways truck, fired directly into a 100-strong crowd at an intersection in Thornton Road. Michael Miranda, age 11, Sean McMullen, age 16, and Jonathan Clazen, age 21, were killed. 13 others were injured. Because it was an ambush, the incident became known as the Trojan Horse Massacre. In 2010, marked the 25th anniversary of the tragedy. So Bester was looking to make this piece to show it around the world, show the effect. I don't think tragedy is quite the word, since this is an expected outcome of the apartheid violence that you would see in Southern Africa. But this had the effect of the Trojan Horse Massacre was widely reported in international media, including in the United States, and even some people in government began to pressure the president, who was Ronald Reagan at that time, to stop supporting Southern Africa, which his administration said that he did, but they continued to secretly support the Afrikaner government until the very end. So, which is a pretty common thing, as we'd seen in Egypt before. So what's kind of interesting about some of these pieces. Oh, sorry. This particular piece eventually traveled to the United States for a show, and whenever it was brought into customs, it was stopped. Originally, Bester had some of these pieces, and he used actual parts from military weapons like AK-47s to be able to make it. This particular piece, despite a warning from the museum that was exhibiting it, was stopped, and they said they couldn't bring it into the country because it had weapons. As you can see, like the weapons wouldn't be usable in the way that they were displayed, but Bester ended up having to take apart some of the pieces and use various industrial pipes and such so that he could finish the piece. So this kind of shows the political power of a piece like this. So this is the one and singular white artist that I'm going to talk about in the entire class. And that's Jane Alexander. This is her Butcher Boys piece. And she was a white South African. And like a lot of white South Africans, especially ones that were well off, she was completely insulated from from the horrors of apartheid. Whenever she went to college, she started to meet people who were, because at this time, again, pressure from the outside was kind of forcing the apartheid government to make some concessions. So she was able to encounter many Black and colored students. And as a result, she started to hear about what was really going on. And she decided that it was her responsibility to kind of talk about this sort of thing. This is her most famous piece, but it's also her graduate student work. And the Butcher Boys is interpreted in many different ways. Some people see these figures as perhaps white police and other officials who are charged with enforcing apartheid. Others may look at it as just like a generalized kind of like animalism, that when people become when they're kind of like in a situation where they're oppressing people and using violence. So it's not really known. Jane Alexander is kind of famous for not wanting to be too precisely talk about her work, especially this early work. As you might imagine, she may be attached to later things a little bit more. So Vasona says, when human beings must shoot unarmed school children and sleeping families, when they allow themselves to torture suspected terrorists and bulldoze whole communities in oblivion, they are transformed into monsters. So Alexander was influenced by Paul Stopforth, who made these three-dimensional vignettes in life size. And his work and activism around torture and detention with Alexander showed it as being very visceral. To her, when she saw this, it was the best way to communicate what was going on. So I was not only attracted to the work conceptually, but particularly the format of the life-size tableau, assemblage, mixed mediums, and aspects of realism. To her, this was a way to get a very intense message through to people that they could not ignore. So in later pieces, she kept going with these sorts of themes, but again, not always wanting to specify this particular meaning. This one, Africa Adventure, it's been made in many different installations. So Alexander consistently mediates on the abuse of power. You may want to look at this and see the qualities and think, obviously it's very bizarre with these animal-like figures, but what could it represent in human society? And think about what Alexander is showing, and perhaps take the extra credit board and try to figure out what Dent means about meditating on the abuse of power. Alexander says, my preference has been to integrate work into a site, then show work in a white cube. I'll show a video, well, I'll give you a link to a video where you can check out some of her work in other places. In this particular one, she brought in dirt, as you can see. I'll explain that in a moment. So my preference, yes, again. So let's check out the next slide. While the anthropomorphized animals seem to struggle to find their way through the landscape, others have adopted traditional male Western dress and stand on wooden boxes to increase their stature. Removed from the dirt floor, each figure faces a different direction, appearing to survey the area they must now control. Alexander's sculptural figures are urban detritus atop the seemingly red clay earth of the continent. In this case, it's the literal. She gathered this type of earth. I don't see the figures fixed to such a particular interpretation. I see them as integral components of a larger presentation, whether in a specific site or as suggested by a fence, base material, or accoutrements, where these aspects may seem apparent as they often do in society. I would hope they could operate in other, even paradoxical ways as well. So this is pretty typical of many contemporary artists. They don't want to be nailed down. They hope there might be some more not necessarily universality, but varying interpretations. The russet color earth points to the ancestral history of the country and the Khoisan. So San peoples were the original peoples. She's taken this earth to kind of associate that with the old history of South Africa. So last artist, Bernice Earl, she was classified as colored because she's mixed African and Euro ancestry. And that meant that under apartheid, she did have a few more privileges, but post-apartheid, she was able to be university trained. And she is a video artist and a photographer, but in a way, she's also a performance artist. But because she's a video artist, kind of makes it cool. We can see a lot of her videos. So I'll post links to a couple of her videos so you can get an idea of what her work looks like. In modern contemporary art, sometimes video artists are seen as, kind of low on the totem pole, but Searle is definitely one of the more thoughtful and interesting ones. So you can see this one's a double projection video installation. Problems crop up because in many cases, my identity has been made for me. So one of the primary ways that she looks at her art is identity, but also how identity, whether she's talking about gender, race, or other identities, can be moldable. It can change through life. It can exist outside because of things like apartheid and other forms of repression, and then exist on the inside. And the conflict between those outside and inside forces kind of causes people to be able to mediate between societal's expectations of your identity and the expectations of identity that you have for yourself. She uses colored materials, especially aromatic spices, to cover a naked body to challenge apartheid's nonsensical concepts of race and social value and to connect her to the lives of ancestors. So this piece, the Color Me pieces, also has other associations. Cape Town was a stopover from the Dutch East India Company spice trade with Indonesia. She's literally using spices in this one. The Color Me series also functions as a direct reference to apartheid and the government's creation of a third racial category for mixed ethnicities called colored, in which Searle is included. And we've kind of talked about these kinds of issues before. I should have talked about this on the first slide. But often oppressive governments, colonial governments, empires, they will want to take a segment of the conquered population and give them privileges. And again, the South African government was influenced by the United States and by the Nazis and the way that they had tiers of privileges. And this allows a kind of divide and conquer type of technique. So the absurdity of that is that it doesn't have meaning to the people that are actually classified as far as their internal view of themselves. But because the external material effects of it are profound, again, the person kind of has to mediate between these two ways of thinking of identity. Searle employs the language of ethnography and anthropology to address racism in South African politics, history, and visual culture. The artist portrays herself in a corpse-like manner, which she's quite fond of. So when she's talking about ethnography and anthropology, perhaps to a lesser extent, there aren't too many people nowadays that would call themselves ethnographers. And the reason why is because embedded in that study and using that term for that study is a kind of imperialism, even if it's a soft imperialism of the ethnographers are coming from colonial governments, and the people they're studying are coming from the colonized. So the colonizers study the colonized. As you might imagine, this creates a disconnect between an understanding of cultures, but also a power imbalance. And since colonialism, made white supremacy a kind of like cultural idea that was so big that most people would ignore it, a lot of work in ethnography kind of served to embed or had embedded within it white supremacy, and you see that in the type of work that's created. Sometimes anthropology is looked at in this way too, but anthropology is generally seen as able to be disconnected from Western worldwide imperialism and white supremacy. So this one, issues of race are unavoidable, especially since the body was a primary state of identification in terms of racial classifications in a South African context, and therefore it cannot be overlooked. One is just be more, however, the ideas of ambiguity and mutability in relation to the concept of identity and the various subject positions we occupy, which are always fluid. So I talked about ambiguity and mutability as far as identity. Part of it is that mediation I was talking about between society and your own internal thoughts. Also, it's changes through life. And when you are hanging out with different people, all of these cause identity to be mutable in some ways. And that's what she's talking about with subject positions. What is your relationship to the people that are around you, into the society around you? And that is always changing. So in this one, she uses pigment ink on cotton rag paper. And as you can see, the paper itself kind of like melts, morphing the black and white colors together. But just like our other work, this has multiple layers of meaning. The work is informed by ideas of veneration and ways in which we remember and commemorate, in this case through the incorporation of flowers and garlands. The material I use is wet paper pulp, heavy material that hugs and shapes and defines the contours of the body, emphasizing the three-dimensionality of the body. I'm interested in the transformation of the body through strategies of revealing and concealing. And in this work, the idea of veil facilitates that interest. We tend to think of the veil only in a Muslim context, but as a tradition in Christianity and in various ancient Roman civilizations where garlands and heavily draped headdresses and headgear were common. Christ's crown of thorns also comes to mind with this body of work. I've worked very strongly with color, not only on a formal level in the way of the bleeding and seeping of the color is absorbed by the body and the garment, but also on a conceptual level, so the black flowers seem ominous. Although these are quiet works, there's a suggestion of suffocation, particularly as the hands are clasped, searching for comfort.